This discussion is hosted by Speak Out Socialists. We're a revolutionary socialist organization. We host these events to engage in discussion and develop what it will really take to end capitalism, a system built on the endless pursuit of profit, where a minority of people, the billionaires, the politicians, and the corporate leaders are able to violently define the lives and futures of billions of people around the planet. We organize today against the atrocities in Gaza and now Lebanon and across the Middle East, but we know we won't stop the wars and the violence so long as there are people in power who benefit from the exploitation of the majority of people. In a period that began with a global pandemic, it feels as if we're halfway through a decade of blatant oppression, exploitation, and disregard for people's lives. We've protested for the lack of PPE measures, safe working conditions, and the complete lack of social support that allowed for a pandemic to kill over 7 million people worldwide since it has begun. The businesses and banks got bailed out, whatever they needed to survive, while we all got a few measly stimulus checks that could not even cover a month's expenses. We protested the countless cases of racist police brutality that led to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many more. The politicians said they would handle it while increasing police budgets and continuing to kill people, all people of color and poor people. We protested the destruction of our environment amidst deadly floods, wildfires, and droughts that continue to worsen in intensity and frequency as the coal and oil keep on burning. And just as in decades before, we are protesting the occupation of Palestine by Israel with the US government's full imperialist support. Those protests, as we know, have turned into protests against the genocide of Palestinian people. The horrors are so brazen, and yet despite the university encampments and the internationally massive protests, even the limited demands of a ceasefire and an arms embargo here in the US feel far away as the day the protests began. These movements and what they protest feel unprecedented, but in fact, they are preceded by a decade of mass mobilizations around the world. In places like Brazil, Egypt, Hong Kong, and Chile, political regimes were overthrown or severely shaken, and yet we're not living in a more just and democratic society. We're still out protesting and watching capitalism's violent destruction of the world, especially on historically oppressed and colonized people. It is not enough to simply protest, but it is a matter of what we learn from our previous struggles and how we organize for structural change. We in Speak Out fight for socialism, a society where the people who do the work and who are affected by the problems get to make the decisions that impact our lives. And to implement that, we need to build organizations of the working class that hold the potential to lead these struggles and build real revolutionary power that could bring capitalism to a screeching halt. This will take more than turning out in the streets, but we have a lot to learn from the past decade of struggles and their limitations. So today we will hear from a journalist who has written a book on the research and interviews he conducted on this topic, focusing on the ties between these struggles and the takeaways that often come from many of the organizers themselves. Vincent Bevins is an award-winning journalist and correspondent. He covered Southeast Asia for the Washington Post, reporting from across the entire region and paying special attention to the legacy of the 1965 massacre in Jakarta, Indonesia. He previously served as the Brazil correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and covered nearby parts of South America. Before that, he worked for the Financial Times in London. Among the other publications he has written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Economist, the Guardian, Foreign Policy, the New York Review of Books, and more. I'm just gonna say more. So Vincent, and then his new book, which we'll be discussing, If We Burn, he'll be talking more about today. And before that was the Jakarta Method, which is about the Indonesian massacre. So Vincent will present for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there will be plenty of time, about an hour, for a question and answer or for comments to dive into what we take away from these struggles. So if you have comments or questions, please write them down so that we can discuss them after the presentation. And just so everyone knows, the presentation is being recorded right now, but the Q&A portion will not be recorded for everyone's privacy, so don't feel like you have to be shy. And with that, we'll let Vincent get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone that's either attending or watching. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me all right. Yeah, it's slightly late for me, but that should be fine. Apologies if I forget something, but I'll try to be coherent and sort of informal. As I understand it, we're going to be having a lot more questions and comments than we have just me speaking. So what I think I would like to do is to take these 20 minutes or so to explain where this book came from, If We Burn, what it tries to do, and what I think it ends up doing. Not only based on what I did in my research, but in the conversations that I've had like this since it came out, have also shaped what I think the book does do. But yeah, this book, If We Burn, is a book about mass protest. And my relationship to that topic is personal. I was living in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a little bit over 10 years ago in 2013, when mass protest arrived at my doorstep or came knocking, or at least the tear gas wafted up to my apartment. I was working as a correspondent in the largest city in South America, tasked with covering contemporary politics in Latin America, when a group of leftists and anarchists put together a series of demonstrations against the cost of the rise of a bus fare in Brazil. Now, this is a group that had been organizing these types of demonstrations since 2005. It was a group that was dedicated in the long term to the full decommodification of public transportation in Brazil. So what they wanted was for all bus fares and metro rides to be free. They wanted working class Brazilians to be able to move about the country without cost. But what they would do concretely is that every time there was a rise in the price of a bus fare or the metro ride, they would organize very raucous, prefigurative street demonstrations. So prefigurative in the sense that they would actually make it impossible to pay for a bus ride by either blocking turnstiles, making payment impossible, mass fare evasion, shutting down the streets. And they'd been doing this for 8 years. Now, in the beginning of June 2013, the first 4 protests that they put on succeeded in shutting down quite a lot of the transportation infrastructure in the city, succeeded in getting everyone's attention, succeeded in shutting down a lot of the main thoroughfares in Sao Paulo. But they didn't succeed in getting the country on side. And when I say the country, I'm referring to the people who make decisions at the political level, and the people who understood about the protest only via the coverage of the protests provided by mass media in Brazil. And major media in Brazil is owned by oligarchs, as it is increasingly also in the United States. But this has been an established part of Brazilian society for a long time, that mass media is right-leaning and oligarch-owned. And so after 4 protests, the people that were fighting about what happened on the streets from these outlets were not sympathetic to them. Certainly the media itself was not sympathetic to them. The political class was not sympathetic to them. But on the day of that, to the point that on the day of the 4th protest, in June 13th, 2013, the mass media in Brazil call for a police crackdown. They say, we need to get, this has gone too far. We need to get these kids off the streets. And if the class of journalists in Brazil came from the part of Brazilian society that usually experiences repression at the hands of the military police, they should have seen what was coming, but they do not, and they did not. The military police in Brazil is, of course, a legacy of the US-backed dictatorship that started with the coup in 1964. But the class of journalists had rarely seen up close what police repression looks like. And so when that crackdown came, it so shocked the nation, and it so shocked the class of journalists in Brazil that had called for it that morning, including because they saw that their colleagues had been hit. I mean, I was hit, but that doesn't matter. But there was other cases that were that went viral of mainstream Brazilian journalists that came from the white middle class that were hit by the repression. This was very shocking. And the crackdown so shocked the country that the media narrative flipped from the morning to the night. From the beginning of June 13th to the end of the day, the mainstream media went from saying, this is a bunch of punks and anarchists that we need to sweep off the streets, to this is something good. This is a glorious uprising in defense of the right to gloriously uprise in defense of something. They couldn't figure out exactly why it was good, but they knew that they were now on the side of this thing in the streets. And so as a result of this flip that happens in the media, but also on social media and across the country at large, you see at the next protest, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And I'd been covering this. I knew people who knew people in the group. I had been sort of watching from afar and then watching up close and then hit by the repression myself in this fourth protest. And when this huge mass of people flooded into the streets 4 days later, it felt to them and it felt to me like it's happening, like everything's happening. This is working. They've done it. But what became clear very quickly is that the people that came into the streets as a result of the new narratives about the protest, the people that came into the streets for new that came into the streets later, came into the streets with the different ideas as to what the actual protests were about. They came into the streets with with motivations that were either their own or supplied by the mass media that had flipped their position just a few days earlier. And these new arrivals came into initially verbal, but ultimately violent conflict with the original leftists that had been organizing the protests since the beginning of June and really back to 2005, to the point where just 1 week later, after that fourth day of the protest and the day of the crackdown that hits me and causes the tear gas to rise up to my apartment, what we would now recognize as the beginning of a far-right movement in Brazil, the beginning of what becomes the Bolsonarista movement, violently expels the original leftists from the streets. They actually throw the leftists and anarchists out of the streets, out of the protest movement they had created, and often bled and struggled to create. So this was profoundly strange. It was not only troubling, but it was profoundly confusing for me and for many of the other Brazilians that had lived through this, the people who had been organizers, who had joined, who had watched from afar. This was a very strange reversal. And, if you know Brazilian history or, more or less what happened last decade, by 2018, you do get the election of a far-right movement in Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro takes over as probably the most extreme right-wing politician in the democratic world. And the people in the Bolsonarista movement, they will look back on June 2013, this mass protest explosion, and say that's where we got our start. And I think that they're not wrong. I think that the leftists and anarchists are also not wrong when they say we were the ones that made that happen. But it seems that Brazil in 2013 was asking for better public services and protesting police brutality. And then a few years later, depending on how you look at it, as a result, gets a government that is slashing public services and celebrating police violence. Jair Bolsonaro famously loving it when cops killed what he considered to be criminals. Now, again, this was very, very troubling. So over these years, as this was happening in Brazil, where I still lived, whenever there was another protest of that type somewhere around the world, soon after we got Ukraine, Turkey was happening at the exact same time, I and Brazilians and people that had lived through the June 2013 explosion and reversal would watch very carefully to what was happening in another part of the world, and often watch with a mix of anxiety and trepidation and say, well, we really hope it doesn't go there the way that it did here. Are they doing the same kind of thing that we had seen here? Sometimes it was more or less true than others. But this was, again, I'm just explaining where my personal relation to this issue came. So as the rest of the decade unfolded, when this kept happening, and it did keep happening, this type of unexpected mass protest explosion around the world, we would watch very carefully. And then I also started to look backwards because I started to come to the conclusion that Brazil 2013 would not have gone the way it did if it had not been interpreted as if it were somehow a replay of the Arab Spring. So I started to look at what had happened starting in Tunisia and then Egypt and Bahrain back at the beginning of the decade. Because by the end of the decade, by 2020, the people that can count these things, and I don't think it's that easy to count these things, but the people that try to count these things came to the conclusion that from 2010 to 2020, more people participated in mass protests than at any other point in human history. So the 2010s succeeded the previous record of this type of contention was the 1960s. And in many, many cases, not this the Brazilian one, things did not go according to plan. And not only did sort of nothing happen, and this was quite a familiar story in the history of mass protests, is that, you know, a huge point is made, but then nothing happens. Often in the 2010s, something did happen, but it was a reversal. It was often seen as worse than the original circumstances that the protesters were trying to change. So having looked forward, having lived through this one case in Brazil, having looked backward, what I decided to do was to try to write a book that would tell a global history of the 2010s. Obviously, you cannot tell the history of the world over the course of a decade. It is not possible to say what happened in the world from 2010 to 2020. So like any work of history, it is built around particular concerns. It revolves around a certain sets of questions that matter, I think, that matter to me, that matter, I think, hopefully to some readers in the present. So I try to tell the history of the 2010s as if the most important thing to happen in that decade is the mass protest that gets so big that it becomes something else. The mass protest that gets so large that it either overthrows or fundamentally destabilizes an existing government, either generates a revolutionary situation or the deep destabilization that necessitates some kind of a reform to the given countries. And the history revolves around one, again, very puzzling, confounding, difficult question. How is it that so many mass protests apparently led to the opposite of what they had been asking for? I'm a journalist, not a historian. This is also very recent history. So I think it made sense to take a more journalistic approach to this topic. So the project is a global history. The method was interview. I went to 12 countries and interviewed between 200 and 250 people, trying to put together the story of this decade, asking people, you know, often organizers that were there from the very beginning, often people that joined in the middle, often the state that was somehow called upon or needed to respond to the situation in the streets. Through interviews, I tried to put together the story of this decade, only choosing those cases that, as I said, either actually overthrew a government or got so large that they fundamentally destabilized them. So very quickly, like, I'm not going to discuss each case, but very quickly, that is Tunisia, then Egypt, then Bahrain, then Yemen, then Turkey, then Brazil, then Ukraine, then Hong Kong, Indonesia, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Chile. So there's a lot there. But what I thought the best to do was to put it into a chronological story. Now, the answer to that question, how is it that so many protests led to led to the opposite of what they were apparently asking for, I think is in the history itself. I don't think there's a way to sort of run a statistical regression and say, well, this was the one element, or in each case, things are different. And part of the mistake that was made by people in my class was to treat things as if they were the same just because they kind of looked the same on TV. Like there was a big crowd, so they looked like they were the same thing. So I think that history is the answer to that question. So hopefully the book tries to supply the nuance that is really inherent in each particular case. But also, you know, for a discussion like this, it is possible to talk about a framework that emerges from that history building, from this project, that allows us to answer the question in individual cases, that allows us to sort of understand how things can go in one case or another, that allows us to understand each individual case. And in order to construct that framework, what emerged from my investigations and ends up being integral to this framework for understanding each individual case, is that I believe that in the 2010s, a particular set of responses to injustice, a particular recipe of tactics, a particular set of things that you could do, when human beings experience elite abuse, became hegemonic, often appearing to be the natural way to respond when governments or elites commit abuses. In the sociological literature, this is called a repertoire of contention. It's all the stuff that a very large amount of people are capable of doing and feel that it is possible and desirable to do in response to abuse. And I believe that there's a particular recipe of tactics, there's a particular approach that became that became hegemonic in the 2010s. So that recipe, as I see it, is the apparently spontaneous, leaderless, digitally coordinated, horizontally structured mass protest in a public square or a public space. Now, in the book, I try to very quickly explain where each of those things come from, but the point is that they each come from somewhere. They each have ideological and historical precedents. They both have material and ideological causes, and you could take them apart one by one, and that could be an entire discussion, an entire book, certainly. But for example, I mean, protest is not even that old of a phenomenon in human society. And I think emerges alongside the existence of mass media. Digital coordination is something that is more material. Like we have the creation of for-profit advertising driven social media firms on the contemporary internet, and that made certain types of things possible and certain types of things easier. Everyone understands that social media sort of did something to how we carry out protests, but then other elements have more of a normative element, right? So leaderlessness is something that happens in practice, but there's also certain ideological traditions that have developed that said it's good to be leaderless. There's others that say that it is not. So these all come together for concrete, material, and ideological reasons, and I think that's important to stress, only to emphasize that I differ from accounts, or often like this is not even stated outright, but ideas about revolt that say explicitly or assume implicitly that human beings just sort of react naturally with the correct thing to do spontaneously. I think that everything we do is learned, and and everything we do has history. So the historicization of these tactics, I think, was important for me too. So then what I see happening with this particular repertoire, this particular recipe of tactics, is that it is far more successful than anticipated at putting people on the streets. It is far more successful than was planned for, or even often than it was ever supposed to be effective for. Than what it was supposed to be effective for, which was just the generation of huge amounts of numbers on the streets or in public spaces. Way more people came than in most of the cases that I looked at in this book, than even the organizers, not even like expected, than they hoped. Like if you would ask them, like, how many do you hope in like your ideal world would come next week? The actual number that came was like 20 times that, right? So this particular recipe was incredibly effective, more effective than expected, often more expected than than the most intelligent, the most coherent defenders of this particular repertoire had ever expected it to be useful for. And this meant the creation of real opportunities. The huge amount of numbers that came into the streets either unseated existing governments. So in the most extreme case, you get like the dictator jumps on a plane and flees the country. Or in the less pronounced cases, the opportunity is for profound transformations to the existing system, because the elites that are there, if they haven't fled, the daily life has become so impossible to reproduce that they know that they have to give something to the movements. They have to give something to the streets. Now, in the case of these real opportunities generated by these huge amounts of numbers in the streets, it turned out that a protest, and especially a protest that is constituted in this way, was very poorly suited to taking advantage of these opportunities. So in the case of a power vacuum, there's no government. A protest, especially a protest of this type, proved unable or unwilling, usually both, but especially unable to enter that power vacuum and to set up sort of a transitional government or a revolutionary government, or even be involved somehow in the transition from one state of affairs to the next. And then in the less pronounced cases where you had governments turning to the people, and Brazil was one like this, because in the Brazilian case, there was not a dictator as there was in Egypt. There was a democratically elected, left-leaning, popular president who herself was a Marxist guerrilla, and came up, always truly believing in supporting the streets and supporting movements from below. And so in the cases where existing elites turned to the people and said, "Okay, what do you want? I know I got to give you something. You win, basically. You win. What do you want?" Often in those cases, it proved impossible to even elaborate a set of demands that would allow the system to be transformed in some way, that would allow sort of the streets in some way, whoever that was, to extract some kind of a victory from the opportunities that they'd created. So then, as a guide, a very quick and easy guide framework is the word I used to explain what happens in each case, is you just have to look at who does take advantage of the opportunities. In many cases, you see imperialist counterattack. So this is something we saw often in the 2010s. Some power in the region, or maybe maybe the biggest, baddest guy in the neighborhood, or the biggest, baddest guy in the entire global system, which is the United States, sees opportunity or sees a situation that requires action in the minds of the elites of this given country, and they move. They move. They respond militarily. They respond to crush a movement or to impose a solution on it. You get local elites taking advantage of the situation. You get reactionary movements that are well placed to take advantage of these opportunities, sort of stealing the lunch of the original protesters. And then in other cases, in some of the cases, the people that did take advantage of the opportunities were kind of from the same world, ideologically, socially, politically, as the protest movement, as the people in the streets. And these are the cases where you see relative victories. These are the cases where you see things going more or less well, where you could call these qualified wins or qualified victories. I mean, Chile 2019 would be one of the classic examples of that. But in no case, and this is important, at least in the cases that I looked at least in the 2010s, in no case did a protest movement of this type, this apparently leaderless, spontaneous, diffuse, ideologically diverse mass protest movement, actually effect the outcome. It was always somebody else that came and did it. And sometimes it was their enemy, which meant that things went backwards. Sometimes it was a sort of a mixed bag because it was another group that just changed things, but not for the better or worse. And in the cases that it was sort of a win, it was sort of their allies, but it was never the streets. And then I didn't just build this history. Part of the reason that so many of these people wanted to talk to me over the course of 4 years was that I also wanted to ask them what they had learned, what they reflected upon after reflecting upon what happened, what lessons they would give to a younger generation of organizers or protesters, or just people that might live through a kind of explosion of this type. I got a wide range of answers, but there was quite a lot of overlap on certain things. One thing that I heard very, very often was, we wish we had been more organized before history came knocking, before the explosion, before things went crazy. Because in the moment of opportunity that came very, very quickly, there wasn't time to build the networks that would allow us to democratically and collectively act. We wish we had built in the off season, is one way to put that. Another thing that was often stressed was that representation is essential, and that if you reject representation, or if you are incapable of representing yourself, and this goes back to like Marx's 18th Brumaire, this is not a new insight, but people rediscover certain things in history for certain reasons, which is a theme of the 18th Brumaire itself. Anyways, if you do not or cannot, do you not want to or cannot represent yourself, someone else will represent you for you. Representation will be imposed upon you. And this was often done by people in my class. Many of my interviewees came to the conclusion that this particular type of revolt, this particular type of uprising is especially vulnerable to the imposition of narratives from the outside, of media showing up and saying, this is what they're asking for, just saying whatever they want them to be saying. And, you know, because there's such a diverse group of countries in the book, the type of organization that people get into, the type of organization that people see as possible, you know, really varies. You know, you get a mix of the return to trade union organizing, revolutionary parties, social movements, parliamentary parties, depending on the system in your country, if that may, if change in that way might be possible. But no one that I spoke to came away from the decade being more excited about full spontaneity or full diversity of ideological participation, or full structurelessness. One way that one Egyptian put it, maybe I'll just end here and take your questions, is he's just said, organize now. And we thought representation was elitism, but in actuality is the essence of democracy. Because I do think, you know, another discussion entirely, but I do think that we live in a generalized crisis of representation in the global system. The elites that are supposed to represent people, the elites that say that they represent people, do not anymore. And that's not even like a radical take. Like, liberal political scientists have like done the math and like, oh yeah, actually the elites now listen to other political elites that listen to other elites and listen to economic factors rather than listening to their actual populations. And so in the face of this real crisis of representation, the impossibility or the extreme difficulty of having a system where people actually have some kind of effect on the outcome at the top, the attempts to reconstruct that representation in a truly democratic and collective way is something that many of my interviewees came away from the decade stressing as essential. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have.